Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to my video series where I'm going to show you how to build what I consider the best and fastest gaming PCs for specific price categories. And today with the fastest gaming PC you can currently assemble for about $500. As always, I made sure that all the hardware parts fit perfectly together so that we don't waste any money on things that we don't really need. And of course, I think it's important to note that this channel is not sponsored by anybody and neither is this video, so I'm completely free of bias and can really recommend what I think is the best hardware that you can currently buy. And so with this exact build, I can guarantee you that you can expect to get a lot of value for your money. But now let's not waste any more time and let's dive directly into the parts for our $500 gaming PC build. First, in my opinion, the best processor you can currently buy is the AMD Ryzen 5 1600. This processor is great because it offers so much value for money. It has 6 cores with 12 threads and up to 3.6 GHz, which is just insane for this price category. This processor is so strong that in all the games that I tested, I was never bottlenecked by the CPU, which means that the processor was never the reason why I was kept at a certain frame rate. Now in Cinebench, where professionals usually test CPU performances, we can also see that this CPU gets really solid results with 2698 points. And when it comes to the single core test results, they are also very remarkable because we scored 361 points, which is in the range of an Intel i7 6700, which cost way more than our processor here. The temperatures during all the benchmarks and gaming tests were also very stable, and that means that the stock cooler that is included is pretty good and we don't need to waste any money on an extra cooler, which is really good. But I have to warn you, the Ryzen 5 1600 was sold for $85 up until April, which was, to be honest, insanely cheap. But since then I have only seen it for about $100 in many different online shops. And while I still think that for this price it's the processor with the most value for money in this price category, I wouldn't pay a lot more for it, so if you don't see it anywhere close to $100 or less, I suggest waiting a few days or weeks until its price is reduced again. In my opinion, the graphics card with the best value for money in this price category is the Radeon RX 580. Personally, for my build, I prefer the GTS XXX edition with 8GB from XFX, but the difference between the different versions from different vendors is not really significant, so you could just buy the version that's cheapest in your local area. However, you definitely should make sure that it has 8GB. By the way, I will leave the link to the one I bought in the description of this video. Anyways, this GPU is a real powerhouse. For the performance you get here, you had to spend about $400 5 years ago, and now you can get that for just slightly above $150, which is pretty neat. But despite the low price nowadays, it has everything that we need. It has 8GB of memory with almost 1400 MHz memory clock, it is VR ready, and it gave us a great frame rate in all the games that I tested. Of course, we also need a solid motherboard that perfectly supports the Ryzen 5 and our Radeon RX 580. And for that I recommend the MSI B450M Pro VDH Max. This is my personal favorite when it comes to motherboards. It supports all the frequencies that we need for all the other hardware parts I recommend in this gaming PC build. With the B450 socket, it's also future-proof and will provide support for future Ryzen generations. But not only that, it also provides the ability to overclock CPU and GPU, it has all the connectors that we need and want, and of course, it is extremely cheap for what it provides. And so overall, I personally think this is probably the most cost-efficient hardware part in this whole build and therefore highly recommended. When it comes to the memory, I would recommend buying two 8GB RAM blocks from Corsair with 3200 MHz. However, as we will see in the game test that I will show you later in this video, only a few games occupy more than 8GB of RAM. So if you know exactly that you will only play Minecraft or League of Legends for the next few months, then I would say that RAM is the hardware part where you could save even a little bit more money by buying just 8GB of RAM without any huge drawbacks. You could upgrade to 16GB at any time in the future anyways. However, I chose 16GB in my build and all the tests I will show you later are done with that. For the SSD, I chose the PNY CS900 with 240GB. As you know, I recommend this SSD in all my mid-tier gaming PC builds because it's very reliable, extremely cheap and sufficient for a great gaming experience. And for the power supply, I chose the Corsair CX450. In my case, I bought the modular version, which provides better cable management. But I only bought it because it was cheaper at my local store compared to the non-modular version. However, I definitely suggest buying the cheaper one, which is usually the non-modular version. When it comes to the case, I'm actually really proud about this one. If you already watched some of my videos, you know that I usually don't recommend buying anything that has RGB lighting on or in it because it doesn't provide any performance gains while being usually more expensive. However, I tested multiple cases over the last few weeks and the Aeron Cylon has become my new favorite recommendation when it comes to cases in a low budget segment. It provides good cable management, a solid airflow and fan system, enough space for our motherboards and connectors, and it looks pretty nice. And of course, the most important thing, it is really cheap with only about $40. In my last video, I was asked if I could add a building tutorial to these types of videos, and so before we jump into the game tests, here's my first try of a very quick tutorial on how to build this PC. First, we need our motherboard, which has a socket for the processor in the middle. Here we pull the lever of the socket to the side and then all the way up so that we can attach our processor. To do that correctly, the socket has an arrow in one of its corners, and we have to align it with the arrow that you can see here in the corner of the processor. So align it and let it drop into the socket, but don't push it in because we don't want to bend any pins. If you aligned it correctly, it will drop in automatically. After we've done that, we can now pull the lever back to its place. Next up is the cooler for our processor. On the backside, the cooler already has some paste attached to the square that needs to be pressed on top of our processor. To fix it then to the motherboard, we use these 4 screws and we screw them in here, here, here and here. But first we have to unscrew the protection and remove it. And after we have done that, we can place the cooler on top of the processor. But be careful here, the AMD label should be on the left side so that we have enough space on the right side for our RAM. Now we screw it on tight and our cooler is attached. What's left is the cooler power connector, and this should be put on the CPU fan 1 connector of our motherboard. Now that we have done that, we want to attach the motherboard to the case. In general, motherboards come in different sizes and therefore every case has some fixed female screws and some optional ones. And for the motherboard that we use here, we should put in 4 additional ones. Here, here, here and here. And of course, before we attach our motherboard, we should also install our I/O shield. Just press it into the back of your case and don't be afraid, it usually takes a little bit of pressure. After we've done that, we can finally put in the motherboard, align it with the I/O shield and the screws and fix it with these. In the end, it should look like this, with the screws fixed in these places. Next up is the RAM. For the installation, we open the DIMM slots A2 and B2 by pressing the retaining clips outward, and then we push the blocks in by making sure that we line up the notch of the RAM blocks with a break on the slots. Now take the connector of the fan and attach it to the system fan 1 slot. After that, we can finally install our graphics card. The way we do that is we first remove these 2 screws from the backside of the case. Then we take off the bracket and the cover in slot 1 and 2. Now we can install the graphics card by pushing it into the PCI Express slot here. And then we can fix it with the bracket. The power supply needs to be put into the bottom part of the case, preferably with the fan pointing downwards. Here we can fix it with another 4 screws. After the power supply has been installed, we can now connect the power connectors for the motherboard, the processor and the graphics card. And now we can connect all the case cables, and we start with the HD audio connector that has to be put into the J-OD1 slot. After that, we connect the 3 USB ports, the 2 small USB 2 connectors and the large USB 3 connector. The connectors for the front switches and the LEDs are somewhat customizable, but you can find a description of how to connect them in the manual for the motherboard. However, the pins for them are here. Now the only case connector that's left is the SATA connector for the large front LED, and you want to connect that to the power supply. After we've done that, the only thing that's left is the SSD. This is the place inside the case where you can install the SSD. The SSD has to be connected to the SATA port and the power supply. And then you can mount it to the case via screws on the backside. And after you've done all these things, you're finally finished and can now close the case and enjoy your PC. And now, as promised, let's jump into the benchmarks and game tests. I tested this gaming PC in the 3D Mark Time Spy benchmark and then in the games League of Legends, Fortnite, Call of Duty Warzone, Witcher 3, Path of Exile and Valorant. By the way, I usually test what I think are the most popular games right now, but if you think I should include some other games to my tests, please write in the comments so that I know what you would like to be tested in the future. Anyways, in 3D Mark Time Spy, this gaming PC build scores 4,457 points, while the graphics score is 4,273 and the CPU score is 5,901. What we can see here is that this PC is very well balanced, with the CPU being a little bit stronger in general. That means that if we wanted to upgrade this gaming PC in the future, we would usually try to target the GPU. However, in my opinion, the GPU score is also really solid, and I think these scores are in general just about the best you can get with about $500 of new hardware parts. Now, when it comes to the game tests, I have to note that all the tests were done with the recording software in the background and on a 1080p screen. So if you play in Full HD without a recording software, you should expect a performance that's a little bit better, while you should expect fewer FPS if you play on a screen with a higher resolution. Now, the first game I tested was, as always, League of Legends. Here I had about 180 FPS at the highest settings, so this game can easily be played even at the highest ranks if you're one of those competitive guys. The second game I tested was Fortnite. Here I got about 210 FPS on average with low settings and 60 FPS with max settings. So Fortnite is also no problem for this $500 gaming PC build. For the third game, I tested Call of Duty Warzone. Here I had not a lot of difference between low and max settings. I had about 110 FPS on low settings and 70 FPS on max settings. I felt that the PC was good enough so that the playing experience was very enjoyable. By the way, Call of Duty Warzone was the only game I tested that occupied more than 8 GB of RAM. So if you want to play that, I definitely recommend getting 16 GB of RAM. The fourth game was Witcher 3. On low settings I had 95 FPS and the game felt smooth. However, at the highest settings the game didn't feel perfectly smooth since it averaged about 50 FPS. By the way, this was also the only game where I didn't get more than 60 FPS even on the highest settings. But with this gaming PC you can definitely play Witcher 3, even though I would recommend to set the settings to high instead of highest. Path of Exile was the fifth game, and here I got about 70 FPS on highest settings and 185 FPS on lowest settings. So definitely an enjoyable experience. And the last game I tested was Valorant. I have to say that even though this game is very new, it's really well programmed since I had no problems reaching 190 FPS even on the highest settings. So overall, I would say that I'm really impressed by the results and how much performance you can get nowadays with such a low budget when you make sure that all the parts fit together and when you make sure to save the money in the right spots and use it for something else where it makes more sense. Of course, my recommendations for the hardware parts at these specific price categories will change over time, and therefore I created a website that I update regularly, so when you watch this video a few months from now, you can always go there and you will find the builds with the guaranteed best value for money. As always, I leave the links to all the parts of this specific build in the description. Anyways, I hope you guys found this video very helpful. If you do so, you can always leave a like to show some support. And of course, if you're new to this channel, you can also subscribe, so that you can always easily find some great gaming PC builds that are optimized for gaming performance and price.